Okay, hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to talk about economics of bribery and corruption. And basically what I'm going to do for the first part, this is going to be a lecture split between two videos. For the first video, I'm going to talk about the first two papers here. And so this is a paper by Basu with an interesting suggestion for how to address harassment bribes in India. And then here is a sort of applied theory paper that brings to life this modeling and then tries a number of different regimes to see, okay, like what does the economic theory predict if we go ahead and do the modeling? And so this is actually so firstly, it's an interesting topic to begin with. Secondly, I think it's really interesting to work through, or at least kind of appreciate what they're doing in this paper and to see, like, when I talk about kind of one of the tasks before us when we're doing sort of applied economic reasoning being that we want to think about what are the relevant assumptions we need to fit the world. Well, they kind of do this here, and they try to vary a number of different assumptions. They do this modeling using a sequential game, and you can kind of see what happens under a wide variety of different assumptions. And so this kind of gives a really good insight into, well, when would this proposal work? And theory gives us a prediction. So that's kind of the way to think about this paper. Firstly, to add value and some level of sort of analysis to this proposal. And secondly, just from the standpoint of hopefully as part of your economic education, like appreciating how applied theory actually can work, and maybe take some inspiration for developing models for your project for the course, or for other maybe a thesis or other things of interest. Then the second video, I'm going to cover a paper. This is actually thinking about cartels. So think about corruption, so cartels, and then a couple different regimes, again, to see how different anti-cartel type law policies could work to limit some of the problems. Oh, and I realize I've got the wrong year here. So this is, I think, was the working paper was 2003. Martin D is Dufwenberg reminded me that this is the wrong. This is not the actual publication year. I think here I've cited the working paper version. And maybe I did that because you can access the working paper version without being logged into the university library. It's just like freely available. And then here's another paper thinking about bribery again with a laboratory experiment. As a matter of fact, so this first one is just a proposal. Then this is an applied theory paper looking at what economic theory says about how this proposal might work and when it might work. For the second video, I'll do actually two experimental papers to kind of think about how students in the laboratory responded under a variety of different treatment conditions to give us insights into this phenomena. So that's going to be kind of I guess this is a little bit of a long overview for this video and then the next video, but that's going to be what I'll do. So I'm going to stop like right here at this particular video and then jump into lecture 2. All right, so usually, like in class, I like to show this video, kind of talk about the scale and size of corruption. This is from the European Union. Here's some slides thinking about like some of the issue of foreign bribery. And this is all just sort of like, you can go find this. The issue is this is all just to motivate the fact that bribery is it's a really big problem, both from the standpoint of, well, we accept it to be immoral. Also, it's economically significant. And there's some problems here. It's really interesting to think about what economics has to say about bribery. So there's a couple of different ways this could break. Firstly, it could be that bribery is adding nothing. It's completely inefficient. It's just an additional transaction cost and maybe distorting the way that the market works. And I think that's kind of the preferred view. I think other things equal, that's kind of the view that I take. Now, it could also be that bribery helps overcome some inefficiency. We got some insight into this by virtue of having considered the allocation mechanisms lecture, where I was talking about, well, suppose people were able to pay for this additional complementary good above and beyond what they're supposed to be buying. So you go to an amusement park and you buy the ability, like you buy a higher ticket to give you the right to be able to cut in line, right? So you're buying the ticket. That's essentially like it's not a good, it's like the main service you're interested in is like riding these amusement park rides. But then you've now bought something else, which is the ability to cut the line, this interesting complement, which we might question whether that should be for sale in the first place. There's an interesting discussion there. That's obviously, this is coming from Michael Sandel's book. And so anyway, this is sort of in that same spirit. We could think of a situation where Well, I mean, maybe the bribe is allowing us to allocate whatever this is to the highest bidder, to whoever's got the highest willingness to pay. From that standpoint, maybe it's improving efficiency. So now this is interesting. What you want to do is you want to reflect on which set of circumstances is necessary for one or the other to be the case, right? So think exactly when will bribery make the market, make the outcome more efficient, and exactly when will bribery make it less efficient? So that's interesting to kind of look into. All right, so like I said, for this lecture, I'm going to talk about this first paper. So why, for a class of bribes, the act of giving a bribe should be treated as legal. And then the second one is legalizing bribe giving. This is the applied theory paper that's going to bring to life, in terms of like applying the economic theory, specifically game theory, to analyze this paper. Then in the second video, I'll cover blowing the whistle, which is like the cartels paper. And then I'll think about bribery, greed versus reciprocity, which is another experimental paper right here. And then I'm not going to talk about this paper, but this one's interesting as well if you find this research compelling. All right, so here's a clip. I think I verified I think these do work. I don't know. So if this was class, I would play these clips. We kind of reflect on it. It's kind of like an interesting introduction. I guess now it's just kind of awkward because the class is way less interactive with this format. But anyway, so the question I want to pose to you before you go further, maybe, I don't know, stop the video to give yourself a second to think. Should bribe giving or bribe taking be legal? And then kind of think about the consequences of either of the two regimes. So what policy responses might be appropriate to regulate bribery more generally? So, all right, so this is two separate questions. Firstly, should it be legal to give bribes? Should it be legal to take bribes? Okay, even apart from that, would we want to have some way to regulate bribery? And what sort of policy would we want to regulate bribery? I don't know, kind of explore this for a second before we consider this proposal. All right, so here's now a paper presenting this proposal that instead maybe we could legalize the act of giving a bribe. So actually I'll kind of go through the motivation here and kind of set the stage, but that's kind of not the status quo, right? Okay, so what the paper is going to do is it's going to present this proposal, and the goal is to reduce instances of bribery, right? So if this proposal goes through, if the logic is right, the goal would be there should be less bribery overall. Now, this isn't just like all types of bribery. This is specifically focusing on harassment bribes, where you might have the requirement to pay this bribe to just be able to receive something you should be entitled to anyway. And this is a particular issue in some parts of the world, specifically in India, where the author is writing from. Actually, this is like a economist who is like a government official at the time. I forget exactly what the position was, but it was some sort of economic ministry or sort of advising position in the government. And so this is not like this isn't just some professor who's giving this interesting proposal to alleviate the problem of bribery. Like, this was actually like, somebody in a position of I don't want to say power, but at least like maybe actually, if I shouldn't, they very well might have had some type of management or governance power. Point is, this isn't me giving this proposal, right? This is somebody important who's come up with this proposal, and so therefore, maybe we take it a little bit more seriously. I don't know. So, all right, coming from the paper, this sort of observation, and I've had this confirmed by some of my students, that indeed bribery is a problem in India. And so Basu is saying it's a scourge, it deserves to be banished. This is definitely from the perspective that bribery is leading to greater inefficiency, right? So an example would be if there's some type of bureaucratic or paperwork delays, right? So for instance, maybe there's a problem getting your income tax refund. Maybe it's withheld until you make a cash payment to the officer who is there specifically to give you your income tax refund, right? Or, maybe you have to have some paperwork necessary to receive government benefits. And then maybe actually this paperwork doesn't go through until you've paid a bribe to whoever it is that's working in the office that's making this happen. Or, maybe you want to purchase a train ticket and you have to pay a bribe to be able to obtain the train ticket or to get a driver's license, whatever is the case, right? So these are things where the way that the market or whatever is the transaction is organized, it wasn't designed to involve any payment to whoever is the bureaucrat or whoever is the office or whoever is the person actually in the position that's doing this job. However, they've shifted things such that they're able to, end up getting some payment on the side. All right, so recognizing that this can be a big problem in some parts of the world, recognizing that not only is this a problem, but it's not uncommon, right? And so the idea would be, okay, well, let's change things. I mean, typically, the law has been to criminalize bribery, but from a different perspective. And the proposal here is to say, okay, well, let's make it such that it's perfectly legal to give the bribe, but it's illegal to accept the bribe, right? So then what ends up happening, or as the proposal says, is you want it such that whoever gives the bribe, whoever's like the customer that's required to pay the bribe to receive their driver's license or whatever, that person receives immunity, relative to the state. And the important observation, and why we should think that this might work, or why we'd have reason to believe that this could in principle work, is the fact that this changes the incentive structure in a really important way. After the bribery has been committed, the interests of the bribe giver and the bribe taker are divergent, right? It's not the case that they both want to keep it secret. No, one of them might want to keep it secret, but the other one doesn't have any incentive to keep it secret and might want to tell the authorities so as to be able to recover this bribe that they weren't excited to pay in the first place. So the hope is the bribe giver might be willing to cooperate in getting the bribe taker caught. And then, maybe there could be some type of legal proceedings to be able to provide or return that money to the bribe giver. The problem is, or the way that this, in terms of like the outcome is, then the bribe taker presumably figures this out and can be deterred from taking the bribe because they might think, oh, you're just giving me this bribe so you can get your driver's license. And then as soon as you've got the license, you're going to turn around and, I don't know, maybe you're recording it on a smartphone, or you're going to take a picture and then send it to the authorities or something like this. And then as soon as I do my job after I've having taken the bribe, you're going to turn me in. And so this makes the prospective bribe taker considerably more suspicious, I suppose, and then less likely to solicit bribes in the first place. All right, so in terms of like what the status quo was, the current Indian laws, the Prevention of Corruption Act 1988, makes bribe taking by a public servant and bribe giving equally wrong, punishment of 6 months to 5 years imprisonment. The problem is, though this law is on the books, evidently it's not, it's either not enforced or it's just like so widespread that it's not able to have the desired consequence to be able to alleviate the problem of bribery. So Basu's proposal is, let's change the law. Let's make it known that the giver has immunity before, and the taker is going to have the heftier penalty, as well as has to return the bribe. So the hope is, again, the incentive structure might shift such that the bribe giver is going to actually want to document the incident and then be able to collect evidence, maybe secretly take a photo or label the currency that they're actually exchanging, such that they have a way to be able to identify or alert the authorities that this has happened, with the hope being that instead the bribe's not taken in the first place. All right, so the way that like typically in class I like to introduce this proposal and then like ask these questions. So firstly, like what's your immediate reactions to the proposal? Would the proposal work? Are you convinced? Should bribe giving, but not taking, be permissible? How might ethical considerations interact with the underlying behavioral economics? Could this work in other contexts? Could it work in the US? Could it work in the European Union, in China, right? So, and also, can you think of like other types of acts that are besides bribe taking that are criminalized, presumably evenly on both sides, or maybe one side or the other is more heavily punished? And then thinking about like what could happen if you change the side that the law favors, right? Okay, so that's interesting. Next thing we want to do is we want to think about bringing this to life through applying economic theory. So that this, like, firstly, I think this is cool because this paper is going to provide a little bit more insight into when and why we might expect this proposal to work. But secondly, like, even if you don't have any interest, maybe like nothing I've said has been interesting so far. Okay, fine. Hopefully at least you find something interesting from the standpoint of seeing how the economic theory is working here. So, maybe bribe giving, bribe taking, maybe that's not super compelling. I think it is, but suppose it's not. Then what I want you to focus in on, and even if it is, I want you to focus on exactly how these authors are working to bring to life this proposal, right? Using game theory methods to be able to find equilibria and then make predictions, right? So when we're using economic theory, there's a couple different sort of goals of using economic theory. One might be to be able to provide a good description, a good understanding of the way the world works, right? To be able to say, okay, well, here's an economic model, here's the relevant assumptions, and then these equilibria from this model explain to us like why we end up with the outcomes that we see. So that's like the explanatory purpose of theory. But then there's also the predictive power version of theory. This is to say, okay, let's build this economic model, let's tweak things a little bit, and then see what equilibria we might expect. And the idea is like, if we build this nice model, now we get some insights, and then if we actually want to do this in practice, we've got this sort of light, this sort of guiding light to be able to follow. All right, so that's sort of the goal here. All right, so the paper is going to take Basu as the starting point, right? And then think about different policies in terms of hopefully deterring bribery. All right, so importantly, Basu's paper ignited a lively debate, some complaining on moral grounds, others arguing that he ignores important institutional details, right? I mean, look, if you have somebody in the Indian government who's making this proposal, it's gonna get noticed. And actually there's kind of there was a lively debate about this. And so we want to think carefully about, well, which side you want to come down on, whether, maybe we think it's like immoral to allow bribe giving and ought to be equally reprehensible to give and take bribes, or maybe there's important institutional details such that this wouldn't work, or whatever is the case. All right, so in this particular paper though, what they're doing is they're using game theory. They're going to compare equilibria and arrive at conclusions about which legal rules should work in what setting. The theoretical predictions ultimately show legalizing bribe paying while strengthening the sanctions for bribe taking works best if coupled with measures that increase the cost for bureaucrats of denying citizens what they deserve and reducing the cost of citizens getting justice. All right, so now what I'm going to do, you see there's a lot of slides here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to work through, there's like several different versions. I think there's 5 or 6 different game forms that they go through here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the first couple carefully, and I'm going to work through it with the game tree. Thereafter, I'm going to point out like what's different between each ones, and then I'll discuss the findings. I think it's important to do it that way. I want to go through part of it carefully so you understand the modeling and so you kind of recognize like what the paper is doing. And then, if you really have interest, like you can certainly, like I recommend you actually go through the paper and kind of see this for yourself. But I don't want to make the lecture, I don't want it to be boring. And so I want to kind of give us just enough guidance to see what they're doing. And then if you want to like pause the video and work through some of the stuff yourself, that's actually my recommendation. But anyway, that'll be the path that I'll take here. And I think that's historically what I've done for class. And that seemed to be the best approach. Okay. So we've got a stylized model for harassment bribes. We've got 2 players. An entrepreneur, henceforth, will be E, and a civil servant, henceforth, will be S. The government employs the civil servant to issue licenses to people like our entrepreneur, but it's within the civil servant's power to deny the entrepreneur this treatment. They're not supposed to, but they can, right? It's within their power. That's what it means. It means it's within their power. It doesn't mean that they very well might be illegal, depending on which game form we're in. It's just that they have the power to deny the treatment. And matter of fact, like that's what happens when you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles or Secretary of State. You go to get a driver's license. The person you're working with it's within their power to not give you a driver's license. Now, maybe they're breaking the law by not doing so, but it is certainly within their power to not do their job, right? Okay, so this should not be like an unfamiliar setup. Now, the civil servant might require a bribe, and the entrepreneur may choose to offer it. So this is saying, they also may not, and the entrepreneur may or may not offer a bribe. Now, we're going to assume bribery is widespread, so there's practically no chance of being caught unless one of the involved parties is the one who reports it. Now, even with benevolent law enforcers, a party reporting the bribe faces some cost of proving the claim to be true. That's natural, right? There's some transaction cost. It's costly, right? Like even if there was a system where you could go and you could like videotape, you could have your friend videotape this exchange of money and then you get your license. Even if you have like this video and then there's this app, this website, you could quickly upload it, right? There's still costs, right? There's still cost to proving the claim to be true. So this doesn't need to be huge. It just needs to be non-zero. Following Basu, assume these costs are smaller than the bribe. They'll set the cost though equal to zero without loss of generality, right? So without loss of generality means that we could set this to be anything, but we're going to set this equal to zero. We've got it kind of taken care of. Now, they can vary that in the different games, and you can think of actually like what this cost. Suppose this cost isn't zero. Suppose it's positive, or suppose it's large. All right. So after the servant makes it clear that the bribe is necessary to receive the license, the situation is described in the following game. So let me show you the game. Then I'm going to read. Let me just show you this real quick. Then I'm going to give the explanation, because right now you're like, wait a second, what are all these letters? So I'm going to explain the letters, and then I'm going to go back to the game. All right, so at the root, the entrepreneur either offers the bribe or doesn't. If there's no bribe, the civil servant responds by issuing the license L or not L, right? If E offers the bribe, the servant has three choices: not accepting the bribe and not issuing the license, right? Not accepting, not issuing license, not accepting the bribe and issuing the license nevertheless, right? Not accepting but issuing the license, accepting the bribe and issuing the license. So accepting and then issuing. If the entrepreneur chooses to bribe and the servant responds with accepting the bribe and then issuing the license, then the players simultaneously decide whether to report or not to report. So that's what these letters are. All right, so let's go back to the game. So at the root, the entrepreneur chooses to bribe or not to bribe. Well, if they don't bribe, this should be an S here, right? This is the civil servant is going to choose either to not give the license, the payoffs are 0, 0, or to give a license. This V, this is the value of the license to the entrepreneur. This little C, this is like the cost to the bureaucrat, the cost of the civil servant, the cost, maybe it's a psychic cost, maybe it's an effort cost, the cost of like doing their job and giving that license. All right, so suppose the entrepreneur, though, gives the bribe. Now the servant chooses to either not accept the bribe and not give the license, okay? Or to not accept the bribe and to issue the license, right? Or to accept the bribe and issue the license. And now they're both choosing either to not report or to report, not report or to the report. And the way that this is drawn up here, player one, right? So player one was our entrepreneur. Player one, this is our entrepreneur's payoffs are the lower ones, right? And our civil servant's payoffs are in the upper right corner, right? And so what this is the value of the bribe. This is the value of the license less the cost of the bribe, right? The price of the bribe is going to be the payoff to if they don't report, nobody reports, then the payoff to the entrepreneur is going to be the value of the license minus the bribe, and then the value to the civil servant is going to be the bribe minus the cost of issuing the license. If they report, if at least somebody reports, in this case, if the entrepreneur reports, they're going to receive the value of the license minus the bribe minus this like fine, right? For having, this is the standard law enforcement. It's equally bad to accept and to give a bribe. So this is like the fine to the entrepreneur. The payoff to the civil servant will be the cost of issuing the license and then the fine, right? Suppose the entrepreneur does not report, but the civil servant reports. Right now, they both pay a fine, and the payoffs again are going to be they're the same, right? And then the same thing if they both. So here's where they both do report, right? So the payoffs are just the same. If somebody reports, the payoff is going to be the value of the license minus the bribe minus the fine to the entrepreneur, and then the cost of issuing the license minus the cost or minus the fine. The reason why is because we're in the path of play where the entrepreneur has bribed and the civil servant has accepted the bribe and issued the license. Right, so that kind of explains those payoffs. All right, so this is the standard law enforcement. This is like the status quo Indian law is what we're thinking about. Right. So again, the payoffs: B is the amount of the bribe, V is the value to the entrepreneur of the license, C is the cost to the civil servant of issuing the license, F and E are the fines if convicted because of a report. All right, so in terms of like the assumptions that we're thinking about, the relative size of these things, well, they're assuming that the fines are larger than the value of the license. The value of the license is bigger than the bribe, and we're assuming that this is all positive. Well, it'd be weird, right, if the bribe was bigger than the value of the license. So yeah, so this needs to be the case. And then the fine has to be bigger than the value of the license, because otherwise you just think of it as like, I've just paid this really large bribe, some of which is going to the government. Okay, so anyway, and then the bribe has to be bigger than the cost in absolute value, right? The cost could be positive or negative, right? So you want the cost of, like, I don't know, the cost to the bureaucrat, the cost to the civil servant of issuing the license to be small relative to the bribe, right? So the bribe is going to more than compensate them for whatever is the cost. All right, so positive cost is relevant if the civil servant has some opportunity cost of not shirking, maybe paperwork or video games, and then shirking their responsibility, and then C negative is relevant if denying the entrepreneur license implies some risk that they're going to be caught in the act and then fired. So we think of overall, though, C being the net effect, right? So maybe this is partially true, maybe this is partially true, but overall we're thinking of just plain old C as being the effect net of these two outcomes. All right, so in terms of payoffs, the assumption that the value of receiving the license is bigger than the bribe, which is bigger than the cost, is key to be able to have scope for corruption, right? There has to be, in some sense, like gains to illicit trade, I suppose. All right, so they assume that the civil servant has all the bargaining power in determining the bribe. So this can be viewed as being set subject to the relevant incentive compatibility constraints. All right, so incentive compatibility constraints are basically just where you know what a constraint is. So like think of like intermediate micro, think of like the budget constraint. So you can consume within the budget constraint, or you could exhaust the budget constraint. Well, incentive compatibility constraints are just what's necessary to be able to guide the individuals on this particular path of behavior, right? So it's basically what's necessary to be able to like align their incentives. There's some really, I don't want to get too much into those details, but it's just, I guess we could just think of those as additional constraints. It gets into like some interesting things with like contract theory and so on and so forth. All right, so anyway, the prediction though is that when C is positive, net positive, each has a weakly dominant choice not to report. Assuming each doesn't report, the game then has a unique subgame perfect equilibrium, where the civil servant chooses to accept the bribe and issue the license following the bribe, and chooses to not issue the license following if the bribe has not been given. And then the best response for the entrepreneur at the root is going to be, well, issue the bribe. So what ends up happening as the outcome, so this is like actually kind of doing like a backward induction solution here. What ends up being the outcome is the entrepreneur offers the bribe to the civil servant. They're going to accept it and they're going to issue the license, and nobody's going to report the bribe. Well, that's a problem, right? This is like, remember what this is doing? This was the standard. This is the standard law. This is the standard sort of status quo Indian law. This is saying what's going to happen. Oh, we're going to get bribes, right? And nobody's going to report it. So I said that's a problem. This is actually good though, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to cook up the situation when, that's going to model what we actually see. Okay, good. Got it. So now what happens if the net cost is negative? Well, assuming the dominant choices of not report are made, now there's a unique subgame perfect equilibria. And so what this involves is the entrepreneur doesn't offer a bribe, but the civil servant issues the license anyway, right? So here, this would be kind of the outcome that we would want. There's no bribe and you get your license. Okay, we could think of like why that doesn't happen. Oh, it must be because this is not true, right? The cost is not negative. All right, so Now what we want to do is think of, well, okay, how can we make this work? So let's consider now the Basu proposal. Henceforth, I'll call that BP. This is legalize bribe giving, double the fine for bribe taking, and make the bribe taker pay back the bribe if discovered. This is illustrated in game 2, right here, right? So legalize bribe giving. So there's not going to be a fine. So there's not going to be any more FE in the, right? There's only FS. There's no FE. There's no fine to the entrepreneur. Double the fine for bribe taking. Oh, so it's going to be 2 FS. Yep, got that. And make the bribe payer pay back the bribe if discovered. So they're going to lose the bribe. Yep. Okay. So this gives us game 2, and we've made those necessary changes, right? So basically, what changes importantly up here is if you pay the bribe, if it's accepted, you get the license and then you report it, right? This is the entrepreneur reports. Entrepreneur gets their bribe back. Don't pay a fine. They get the bribe back. So their payoff is just going to be the value of the license. Then what happens to our civil servant? Well, they're going to have the cost of issuing the license minus double the fine, right? And they no longer receive a bribe, or they no longer keep the bribe, right? Now, suppose we offer the bribe. It's accepted. We get the license. We don't report. They don't report. Well, this is still a situation where the value to the entrepreneur is just going to be value of the license minus the bribe, and the payoff to the civil servant is going to be the bribe less the cost of issuing that license, and so on and so forth through the rest of the game. All right, so with that change, what ends up happening? Well, when the cost is positive, the net cost is positive, we get, if the dominant choices are made in the reporting subgame. By reporting subgame, we mean this one right here. If we play dominant strategies in this game, right, then the game has 2 subgame perfect equilibria. And these are the ones from before. So what can happen? Well, the entrepreneur may or may not offer a bribe, but the outcome is the same. The servant does not accept any bribe and does not issue a license, right? So whether or not the bribe is offered, what ends up happening? There's no license. There's a problem when the government is so poorly organized, right, that C is positive. The Basu proposal is successful on corruption deterrence, so that's good, but reduces the licenses being issued. So there's no licenses. Okay, so that's a problem, right? So what happens, though, if the cost is negative, right? Well, then it's similar between game 1 and game 2. What ends up happening? Well, in the subgame perfect equilibrium path, we get the entrepreneur doesn't offer the bribe, but the civil servant offers the license anyway. So what's so proposition. So with costless reporting and one-shot interaction, meaning there's not repeated interaction, there's no reputation, it's just, sort of a one-time meeting. Basu proposal deters bribes and loses licenses when C is positive and is redundant, you don't need it, when C is negative. All right, so actually, C negative is probably the empirically relevant parameter range. However, the repeated interaction is missing. And they discuss these cases in the paper. If you're interested, you kind of look into it. I kind of want to move on and talk about some of the conclusions and then show these other games, some variations. So conclusions, well, Basu's policy, Basu's proposal, BP, might not be effective against small harassment bribes because the cost of providing proving that a bribe was paid may deter subjects from reporting. However, it can be highly effective against sizable harassment bribes if the quality of institutions is sufficiently high, if the government's not poorly organized, in other words. All right, so basically what they're showing is got some problems, at least theory is finding some problems with the predictions under Basu's proposal. Basu's proposal is likely to have better deterrent effects on environments with pressure on bureaucrats to perform independent of bribes, right? And where little prevents citizens from reporting having paid a bribe when they're not liable, right? So small costs of reporting. They may have this proposal might have a counterproductive side effect in weaker institutional environments, right? When the government's poorly organized, with little pressure on bureaucrats to perform apart from the bribes, right? And where individuals would not be likely to report having paid a bribe, right? So this is actually, this is actually not great, the proposal, because this is saying, hey, probably in the circumstances that we think are closest to what actually is happening in reality, this Basu proposal might actually have bad side effects, which it wouldn't be surprising because like one of the things we learn about policy is that there's always sort of unintended consequences. That's why I want to think really carefully about sort of addressing some of these issues. All right, so the next thing that they do is they say, okay, well, but this is a compelling proposal in the first place. It seems like, all right, let's think about ways in which we could use the economic theory to get the outcome that Basu is saying that we can get. And so what they want to do is they want to say, okay, well, using our modeling so far, looks like Basu's proposal is not going to work out, but how can we change things? And such like realistically, such that like what are the circumstances under which Basu's proposal does work? So that's what they're going to do. So they're going to say, okay, let's introduce legal and moral costs of bribing based on points from this paper. They're going to introduce these new parameters and extend it to the Basu proposal situation. So now what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, well, suppose we have this costly law enforcement where the entrepreneur expects to bear substantial costs to actually get a conviction and to be able to get their bribe back, where the entrepreneur expects that the litigation and further harassment costs are going to be big unless the bureaucrat, the civil servant, actually self-reports or confesses, which might not be reliably likely. So in the first case, in the status quo game, in game 1, the predictions do not change with these additions. They kind of add these additional parameters to get the same outcome, right? In the one-shot game, they get bribes and licenses when C is positive, and they get no bribes and no licenses when C is negative. Remember, C is net of, this is like the cost of issuing the license to the bureaucrat, net of like, there's some things that could be good, some things that could be bad. This is like the net cost of issuing the license. All right, so if the cost of reporting is substantial relative to the bribe, right, this big C, if this is pretty big relative to the bribe, even after paying the bribe and receiving the license, well, the entrepreneur has no incentive to report. Why? Because the costs of pursuing legal action are bigger than the bribe in the first place. All right, so that's this game. Again, we have the entrepreneur choosing to issue the bribe, not issue the bribe. We have the civil servant able to issue the license, not issue the license. The servant can accept and give the license, not accept the bribe, give the license, not accept the bribe, not give the license. And then here is the sub-game, the reporting sub-game. The interesting one is, suppose the entrepreneur reports, now they're going to get the value of having the license less the cost of going through the hassle of the litigation with the authorities. And then the outcome for the civil servant is going to be the cost of providing the license in this case minus double the fine, right? And that's going to be the same if anybody reports. And then if nobody reports, it's just the same payoffs where it's whatever is the value of the license less the bribe, and then to the entrepreneur, and then the value of the bribe, or the bribe less the cost of providing the license to the civil servant. All right, so another proposition. When reporting costs are larger than the bribe, Basu's proposal is ineffective. When reporting costs are significant but smaller than the value of the license, Basu's proposal may not deter bribes but may reduce their size. Okay, so this suggests that Basu's proposal is not going to actually fight small-scale petty corruption, right? This is like if you go to get your driver's license or whatever, and they say, okay, well, you can have your license, but you've got to give me $5. Well, this is suggesting Basu's proposal is not going to do much about that, right? Okay, so it should work better against larger bribes as these provide a stronger incentive for the entrepreneur to incur the reporting costs in order to get the bribe back. Okay, so for Basu's proposal to work, we need the costs not to be high. We need to be relatively costless for the individual to be able to recover their bribe. All right, now suppose some people also suffer a moral cost when they illegally bribe, right? So this is the conclusion from this paper is that, well, maybe legalizing bribe giving actually increases corruption because the entrepreneur who otherwise wouldn't offer the bribe may not do so when planning and not reporting. So what they want to do, or may now do so while planning and not reporting. Anyway, so to explore the situation, we're going to have some probability of conviction if neither party reports. And then we have some illegal bribe giving, some moral costs associated with illegal bribe giving that's going to be incurred by our entrepreneur. So that's now this game. So the variation is again in the reporting subgame, where the payoff to the reporting entrepreneur after having bribed and gotten their license is the value of the license less the bribe minus the fine minus the cost of proceeding pursuing legal action minus this moral cost, right? Okay, so that's kind of what they did. And then suppose nobody reports. Now there's this alpha, which means we're going to get, as an entrepreneur, I'm going to get this fine with some probability alpha. And then my payoff, or the payoff as the civil servant, is going to be the bribe plus the fine. So this alpha, with probability alpha, you're going to get whatever is this value. Okay, so what are the equilibria though? Well, in game 4, without Basu's proposal, no one's going to report. But if alpha and the probability of being detected when nobody reports, and if the moral costs are high enough, the entrepreneur doesn't want to reach the reporting subgame regardless. They don't want to run the risk of incurring the punishment, nor or for sure getting the moral cost. So then the predicted outcome is, well, no bribe and no license. In a case where the cost of granting the license to the civil servant is positive, and no bribes and no license when the cost is negative, right? So, no bribes but a license, right? So this is good. This is the one that you want, right? Where there's no bribes and people get their licenses. These are the same subgame equilibrium paths as before with Basu's proposal, but now accomplished without Basu's proposal. So now this is saying, okay, well, if this is a realistic way, right? If this is a realistic way to think about the world, we actually get exactly what Basu's proposal was looking at, but now without needing Basu's proposal, because this, again, this game 4 is a variation, right? This is, the cost is borne equally between the two, right? This is the variation of the standard status quo is what this was doing. All right, so now with Basu's proposal, let's see what happens. Paying the bribe is no longer illegal for the entrepreneur, so we no longer have a fine to the entrepreneur. Now it's no longer morally reprehensible, so we'll set the moral cost equal to 0. My question, really? I don't know. So maybe, look, so maybe we actually see, and this is worth exploring, maybe we want to see, like, we want to lose the fine for the entrepreneur. Good. I'm on board with that. But maybe we want to keep a moral cost, because just because it's no longer illegal to give the bribe doesn't mean people are going to no longer feel bad having bribed. Like, morality sometimes is correlated with the legal system, but not perfectly, right? There's a lot of things that are legal that people view as immoral, and there's a lot of things that are moral, that governments deem to be illegal. So, okay. Anyway, so as before, they assume the entrepreneur gets the bribe back when reporting. That gives us this game. All right, so this is like Basu's proposal, but with moral costs. The moral costs are 0. And with the exogenous conviction, right? So the possibility of, when nobody reports, that nevertheless the authorities discover. Well, in this situation, now in game 5, right, when the cost of granting a license is positive, there's a bribe and license equilibrium such that corruption increases with licenses, but only if the cost is really big, such that, kind of a strong deterrent against reporting. When the bribe is bigger than these costs, well, Basu's proposal induces reporting, and the no bribe and no license equilibrium persists. Now, that's not good, because we don't want bribes, fine, but we want licenses. When the cost is negative, now there's no change, right? So no bribe and no license. This brings them to proposition 4. With positive moral and legal costs of bribing, Basu's proposal may increase the frequency of corruption. Excuse me. If reporting costs C are large, in which case it may also increase the size of the bribes. With low reporting costs, Basu's proposal either reduces the size of the bribe or deters corruption altogether. Cool. So now what they do, and I'm doing this a little bit out of order because this proposal, you won't recognize this, but I recognize this. This is coming from this leniency law from antitrust. What Dufwenberg is doing is invoking the ideas from this paper, which now, as I'm thinking about it, I wish I would have introduced that. But anyways, this fits most. Obviously, this video needs to be Basu, and then the analysis of Basu, and the next video needs. Okay, so whatever. So, but what they're doing is they're going to say, okay, let's have a new proposal based on leniency laws, where the participating cartel, as they'll explore here, is going to receive immunity from fines to whoever reports first. So in this model, what they're going to do is they're going to grant the entrepreneur similar immunity when reporting having paid a bribe, right? So in other words, if the entrepreneur chooses to report, what they're going to do is they're take away the bribe and take away the fine to the entrepreneur. They'll leave the moral cost and they'll leave the probability of being detected, right? Bribery is still illegal, hence still presumably morally costly, and not reporting the entrepreneur could still be caught and fined with probability alpha, which brings us to game 6. All right, so that is this game here. And now, so the fact that they're leaving morality here and they're saying exactly what I said a second ago, I'm questioning what was their justification for removing M here. So I don't know. Maybe I was too harsh with my criticism. I should go back and look at their justification for what they were doing. I probably just misinterpreted what they were going for. Anyway, so they leave morality here, and anyway, so this gives us game 6. So what's happened is the situation in the reporting subgame, when the entrepreneur reports, they're going to get the value of and after having received the license, after having bribed, they're going to receive the value of the license, less the reporting costs, right? Less this moral cost. And then the fine is going to be assessed to the civil servant they're going to incur the cost of giving the license plus like double this fine. Okay. And then suppose nobody reports. Now there's this cost, this likelihood of being detected with some probability, and then the moral cost as well. Okay, so this is leniency, moral cost, and exogenous conviction. This gives them Proposition 5. A modified version of Basu's proposal, such that amnesty and bribe restitution is conditional on reporting, prevents corruption from increasing because of the moral and legal costs of bribing, when C is relatively large. Okay, so cool. So they get kind of a cool outcome. And so I'll talk about these questions in a second. But anyway, so this is fascinating because they've shown us circumstances under which we're able to get actually kind of the outcome that Basu is hoping for. All right, good. So next thing is like the remaining part of this video is just some questions that I'd like to, like usually in class I'd pose these in discussion for us. So I'll do this now. I won't be able to do this discussion here, but it kind of pose these questions. I show this bribery ethics training video, which is, I think it's British. And if I'm remembering the video, and so you could click through, you could type this in and watch the video. And the questions I pose is, what are the relevant game theoretic considerations in the skit? What I mean by this is, suppose we were going to do an exercise just like these authors have in this paper, right? What would we need to model? That's all I'm asking you here. And then what equilibrium might we expect to suppose? What known game forms might be a reasonable model for the situation described? I actually should have written this all as like kind of one question. And then what does behavioral economics have to say about bribery and corruption? What insights do we have to inform policies and then reduce the prevalence of bribery? And then the last thing, this is a lawyer. I forget what this one was. This is great. What are the relevant game theoretic considerations again? And then what are the relevant incentives, behavioral motivations mentioned in this clips? Are there ways to incentivize whistle blowing? I forget exactly what I don't know, whatever. These are questions here. I kind of want to click through, but also I kind of don't, because you never know what, I don't know. So, but anyway, so when we're thinking about bribery, we're thinking about policy, we're thinking about whistleblowing. The interesting thing that we want to kind of reflect in is, like, how do we model this situation? What are the relevant considerations? And one sort of compelling way to do this is just like they've done in this paper. Let's make 6 different games, 6 different models. Let's argue through, kind of see like how varying the assumptions about which model we want to think brings us maybe to the same equilibrium or to different equilibria. And the goal is to then get greater insights. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you appreciate like kind of seeing the modeling, seeing the applied economic theory in place. This is a brilliant paper, and so hopefully that's helpful. I mean, you actually don't see a whole lot of papers. You don't see a whole lot of things like this in economics courses. Usually, you just kind of see you work a bunch of problems. You kind of see things introduced, but here's like how you would actually use the theory to gain insights as like what you do as an economist. Hopefully that's kind of cool. There's other papers like this. I think this is like one of the more compelling ones, especially for this class, which is why I've included it. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the paper. Take a look at it. Hope you enjoyed the video, and then I'll see you in the next video where I'll talk about this paper, and then so on and so forth. So anyway, I'll see you.